But you have to go all the way up. For example, the very idea of life. Well, the idea of life is not so strange, because the very fact of any kind of motion, any kind of development of the universe, from one state of matter to another, involves metaphor. It is not a literal translation from one ontological state to another. The whole idea that we start from, from the earth, you work your way up from the earth, from dirt,
right.
You work you up to a higher form. Nonsense. What we're able to do is use the principle of metaphor. And all development of language, all development of artistic composition is based on this principle of metaphor, which is the idea from Cusa of the whole concept of deducta ignorantia, on which all modern science, competent modern science, is based. So we do not, then you get Shakespeare, you get the great poets, and you find a medium in which, as in the great poetry of English poetry in the end of the 18th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, you get the same thing. You are not told or seen what the reality is. What you sense is an analog for the reality, this form of metaphor. And people who believe in literalness are become destructive, because they try to find something in sense perception per se as being reality, rather than realizing that sense perception is not a principle. Sense perception is a condition of human sense perception. And what we can learn is to try to find a place where you cannot simply use a deductive method. There is no deductive connective between truth and sense perception. And so you have to go with the kind of a principle, and a principle means it is a principle. You find that certain things work in a certain way, and this certain way does not correspond to sense perception as such. But you find sense perception is now condemned to behave by something more powerful, which is classical artistic composition.
Right.
And now you take, for example, in the work of on music, is it the same principle? There is no direct access, and people who try to perform Bach or perform other great composers don't know what they're doing. There are a few composers, a few musicians who do know what they're doing. They're the greatest ones. But you see the difference between a trained musician who can play an instrument according to rules and the person who makes this thing come alive. As my experience with in terms of this Furtwängler. Furtwängler was remarkable. His performances have somewhat no relationship to what the ordinary performance is. And we understand what that is. We understand it from the standpoint of Nikisch. We understand but also from Bach. The same principle as Bach. And you see people trying to perform Bach, and it's horrible. It's mechanical. It's absolutely horrible. Then you get someone who really understands Bach and performs Bach, and it's a completely different kind of thing. The juice is gone. The reality is gone. So what about the so-called spiritual character of mankind? What is real passion of mankind for humanity? Completely different kind of thing. It works on the same thing, on the principle of metaphor. It's because you do not demand that sense perception be the law. You demand that you have to test sense perception to find out what is true about it, or what is true in it.
Right.
And you never come up with an object which be a self-evident object. What you come up with is a metaphor. And the loss of the ability to understand metaphor and to use it is the greatest source of the loss of intelligence, of actual intelligence in our population today. Popular opinion, popular politics, popular this, popular that. Everything that is popular is stupid from a standpoint of humanity. And the struggle of mankind is to free ourselves from stupidity, to understand how the principle of metaphor works. Every great scientific discovery, in principle, as this case in terms of the same thing, is based on metaphor. The very conception of the human mind, as understood by Planck, is based on metaphor. Riemann, the same thing. Metaphor. Classical music, metaphor. All great art, metaphor. There is no direct object of sense perception which defines reality. What defines reality is an efficient expression of metaphor. And that's what our struggle is to do. And the problem is we have not yet attacked the issue that poses. Since sense perception is not a reliable definition of reality, but is only a shadow cast by reality, what is the reality? It is not sense perception.
Right.
Therefore, we have to understand that as we go into space, we try to understand how the galaxy works, for example. What a mess. What a complication. Yet there are laws and principles which are manifest in this process, which we do not know the origin of.
Right.
We know the characteristics of the behavior, and like the glass, these kinds of things. And the problem here is the lack of access to the concept of metaphor is the source, the principal source of the stupidity of mankind, is the loss of classical music and junk music in its place, which is literal this, literal that, literal this.
Right.
That is the source of our problem, because mankind is becoming more and more stupid because of the loss of the understanding of what metaphor is. We do not, with our senses, know anything, except we can know by studying patterns. We can study there are patterns which correspond to a lawful proceeding. We know that corresponds to something, but we also know, if we're intelligent, that it does not correspond to sense perception. That sense perception is a shadow cast by the sense operation. But what all scientific principle, all true principles of true law, of science, are based on the principle of metaphor. And in the case, for example, the case of Planck and Einstein is precisely that. That's the difference. It's the practical people who are the stupid people,
Right.
who are the easy victims of somebody to prey upon, because they rely on sense certainty rather than trying to discover through the power of metaphor, of classical poetry, of classical musical composition, and such things. This is where the mind comes alive. And what you get in the barroom is stupidity and annulment, essentially, eventually. And this is the great challenge, that mankind, in its best period, mankind has always based knowledge on metaphor, on the principle of metaphor. And what we have in classical music, as well, the same thing. As in great drama, as in all great poetry. Anything that is not metaphorical, but is taken literally, is stupidity. And mankind becomes the gull in that case. And this is the great principle. And the principle, we have not taught people classical poetry, classical music, these things, classical drama, all of these things which we call art, classical artistic composition, are based on the principle of metaphor. That sense perception does not tell you the truth. It shows you a shadow of a footprint. And what you learn to do is to find those things where the shadow suddenly takes a form in your mind of metaphor, and you recognize it. That's what you see in all great classical drama. The same thing is metaphor. Shakespeare, metaphor. Great poets, all metaphor. Scientific discovery, metaphor, rather than sense certainty. We have to learn by reading the shadows, and all we have in sense perception are shadows of reality. shadows cast by reality. We have to discover what the truth is that is casting that shadow. And you just invert the ratio. Rather than assuming that the shadow is something which is inferior, is only a shadow. What you would consider the shadow is actually inverse. As you get the case in Kepler's work. Kepler's work, which is so thorough, the most thorough scientific recordings ever made were by him in great detail. Mm-hmm. And the point is, his work is all based on this concept of metaphor. But you have to go all the way up. For example, the very idea of life. Well, the idea of life is not so strange, because the whole idea that we start from, from the earth, you work your way up from the earth, from dirt,
right.
You work up to a higher form. Nonsense. What we're able to do is use the principle of metaphor, and all on which all modern science, competent modern science, is based. So we do not, then you get Shakespeare, you get the great poets, and you find a medium in which, as in the great poetry of English, the very fact of any kind of motion, any kind of development of the universe, from one state of matter to another, involves metaphor. It is not a literal translation from one ontological state to another. Development of language, all development of artistic composition, is based on this principle of metaphor, which is the idea from Cusa of the whole concept of deducta ignorantia.